On waking up the day after the races, Vronsky put on a white linen coat, and without shaving or taking his bath, he distributed about the table moneys, bills, and letters, and set to work. Petritsky, who knew he was ill-tempered on such occasions, on waking up and seeing his comrade at the writing-table, quietly dressed and went out without getting in his way. Every man who knows to the minutest details all the complexity of the conditions surrounding him cannot help imagining that the complexity of these conditions, and the difficulty of making them clear, is something exceptional and personal, peculiar to himself, and never supposes that others are surrounded by just as complicated an array of personal affairs as he is. So indeed it seemed to Vronsky, and not without inward pride, and not without reason, he thought that any other man would long ago have been in difficulties, and would have been forced to some dishonourable course, if he had found himself in such a difficult position. But Vronsky felt that now especially it was essential for him to clear up and define his position if he were to avoid getting into difficulties. What Vronsky attacked first as being the easiest was his pecuniary position. Writing out on note-paper in his minute hand all that he owed, he added up the amount and found that his debts amounted to 17,000 and some odd hundreds, which he left out for the sake of clearness. Reckoning up his money and his bank-book, he found that he had left 1,800 roubles, and nothing coming in before the new year. Reckoning over again his list of debts, Vronsky copied it, dividing it into 3 classes. In the first class he put the debts which he would have to pay at once, or for which he must in any case have the money ready, so that on demand for payment there could not be a moment's delay in paying. Such debts amounted to about 4,000. 1,500 for a horse, and 2,500 as surety for a young comrade, Venovsky, who had lost that sum to a card-sharper in Vronsky's presence. Vronsky had wanted to pay the money at the time. He had that amount then, but Venovsky and Yashvin had insisted that they would pay and not Vronsky, who had not played. That was so far well, but Vronsky knew that in this dirty business, though his only share in it was undertaking by word of mouth to be surety for Venovsky, it was absolutely necessary for him to have the 2,500 roubles, so as to be able to fling it at the swindler and have no more words with him. And so, for this first and most important division, he must have 4,000 roubles. The second class, 8,000 roubles, consisted of less important debts. These were principally accounts owing in connection with his race-horses, to the purveyor of oats and hay, the English saddler, and so on. He would have to pay some 2,000 roubles on these debts too, in order to be quite free from anxiety. The last class of debts, to shops, to hotels, to his tailor, were such as need not be considered. So that he needed at least 6,000 roubles for current expenses, and he had only 1,800. For a man with 100,000 roubles of revenue, which was what everyone fixed as Vronsky's income, such debts, one would suppose, could hardly be embarrassing. But the fact was that he was far from having 100,000. His father's immense property, which alone yielded a yearly income of 200,000, was left undivided between the brothers. At the time when the elder brother, with a mass of debts, married Princess Varia Chakova, the daughter of a Decembrist without any fortune whatever, Alexei had given up to his elder brother almost the whole income from his father's estate, reserving for himself only 25,000 a year from it. Alexei had said at the time to his brother that that sum would be sufficient for him until he married, which he probably never would do. And his brother, who was in command of one of the most expensive regiments, and was only just married, could not decline the gift. His mother, who had her own separate property, had allowed Alexei every year 20,000 in addition to the 25,000 he had reserved, and Alexei had spent it all. Of late, His mother, incensed with him on account of his love affair and his leaving Moscow, had given up sending him the money. And in consequence of this, Vronsky, who had been in the habit of living on the scale of 45,000 a year, having only received 20,000 that year, found himself now in difficulties. To get out of these difficulties he could not apply to his mother for money. Her last letter, which he had received the day before, had particularly exasperated him by the hints in it that she was quite ready to help him to succeed in the world and in the army, but not to lead a life which was a scandal to all good society. His mother's attempt to buy him stung him to the quick and made him feel colder than ever to her. But he could not draw back from the generous word when it was once uttered, even though he felt now, vaguely foreseeing certain eventualities in his intrigue with Madame Karenina, that this generous word had been spoken thoughtlessly, and that even though he were not married, he might need all the 100,000 of income. But it was impossible to draw back. He had only to recall his brother's wife, to remember how that sweet, delightful Varya sought, at every convenient opportunity, to remind him that she remembered his generosity and appreciated it, to grasp the impossibility of taking back his gift. It was as impossible as beating a woman, stealing, or lying. One thing only could and ought to be done, and Vronsky determined upon it without an instant's hesitation: to borrow money from a money-lender, 10,000 roubles, a proceeding which presented no difficulty, to cut down his expenses generally, and to sell his race-horses. Resolving on this, he promptly wrote a note to Rolandak, who had more than once sent to him with offers to buy horses from him. Then he sent for the Englishman and the money-lender, and divided what money he had according to the accounts he intended to pay. Having finished this business, he wrote a cold and cutting answer to his mother. Then he took out of his notebook 3 notes of Anna's, read them again, burned them, and remembering their conversation on the previous day, he sank into meditation. Chapter 20. Vronsky's life was particularly happy in that he had a code of principles which defined with unfailing certitude what he ought and what he ought not to do. This code of principles covered only a very small circle of contingencies, but then the principles were never doubtful, and Vronsky, as he never went outside that circle, had never had a moment's hesitation about doing what he ought to do. These principles laid down as invariable rules: that one must pay a card-sharper, but need not pay a tailor; that one must never tell a lie to a man, but one may to a woman; that one must never cheat anyone, but one may cheat a husband; that one must never pardon an insult, but one may give one, and so on. These principles were possibly not reasonable and not good, but they were of unfailing certainty, and so long as he adhered to them, Vronsky felt that his heart was at peace and he could hold his head up. Only quite lately, in regard to his relations with Anna, Vronsky had begun to feel that this code of principles did not fully cover all possible contingencies, and to foresee in the future difficulties and perplexities for which he could find no guiding clue. His present relation to Anna and to her husband was to his mind clear and simple. It was clearly and precisely defined in the code of principles by which he was guided. She was an honourable woman who had bestowed her love upon him, and he loved her, and therefore she was in his eyes a woman who had a right to the same, or even more, respect than a lawful wife. He would have had his hand chopped off before he would have allowed himself, by a word, by a hint, to humiliate her, or even to fall short of the fullest respect a woman could look for. His attitude to society, too, was clear. Every one might know, might suspect it, but no one might dare to speak of it. If any did so, he was ready to force all who might speak to be silent, and to respect the non-existent honour of the woman he loved. His attitude to the husband was the clearest of all. From the moment that Anna loved Vronsky, he had regarded his own right over her as the one thing unassailable. Her husband was simply a superfluous and tiresome person. No doubt he was in a pitiable position, but how could that be helped? The one thing the husband had a right to was to demand satisfaction with a weapon in his hand, and Vronsky was prepared for this at any minute. But of late, new inner relations had arisen between him and her which frightened Vronsky by their indefiniteness. Only the day before she had told him that she was with child, and he felt that this fact, and what she expected of him, called for something not fully defined in that code of principles by which he had hitherto steered his course in life. And he had been indeed caught unawares, and at the first moment when she spoke to him of her position, his heart had prompted him to beg her to leave her husband. He had said that, but now, thinking things over, he saw clearly that it would be better to manage to avoid that, and at the same time, as he told himself so, he was afraid whether it was not wrong. If I told her to leave her husband, that must mean uniting her life with mine. Am I prepared for that? How can I take her away now when I have no money? Supposing I could arrange, but how can I take her away while I'm in the service? If I say that, I ought to be prepared to do it. That is, I ought to have the money and to retire from the army. And he grew thoughtful. The question whether to retire from the service or not brought him to the other and perhaps the chief, though hidden interest of his life, of which none knew but he. Ambition was the old dream of his youth and childhood, a dream which he did not confess even to himself, though it was so strong that now this passion was even doing battle with his love. His first steps in the world and in the service had been successful, but 2 years before he had made a great mistake. Anxious to show his independence and to advance, he had refused a post that had been offered him, hoping that this refusal would heighten his value, but it turned out that he had been too bold, and he was passed over. And having, whether he liked it or not, taken up for himself the position of an independent man, he carried it off with great tact and good sense, behaving as though he bore no grudge against anyone, did not regard himself as injured in any way, and cared for nothing but to be left alone since he was enjoying himself. In reality, he had ceased to enjoy himself as long ago as the year before, when he went away to Moscow. He felt that this independent attitude of a man who might have done anything but cared to do nothing was already beginning to pall, that many people were beginning to fancy that he was not really capable of anything but being a straightforward, good-natured fellow. His connection with Madame Karenina, by creating so much sensation and attracting general attention, had given him a fresh distinction which soothed his gnawing worm of ambition for a while, but a week before that worm had been roused up again with fresh force. The friend of his childhood, a man of the same set, of the same coterie, his comrade in the corps of pages, Serpuhovskoy, who had left school with him and had been his rival in class, in gymnastics, in their scrapes and their dreams of glory, had come back a few days before from Central Asia, where he had gained 2 steps up in rank, and an order rarely bestowed upon generals so young. As soon as he arrived in Petersburg, people began to talk about him as a newly risen star of the first magnitude. A schoolfellow of Vronsky's and of the same age, he was a general and was expecting a command which might have influence on the course of political events, while Vronsky, independent and brilliant and beloved by a charming woman though he was simply a cavalry captain who was readily allowed to be as independent as ever he liked. Of course I don't envy Serpuhovskoy, and never could envy him, but his advancement shows me that one has only to watch one's opportunity, and the career of a man like me may be very rapidly made. 3 years ago he was in just the same position as I am. If I retire, I burn my ships. If I remain in the army, I lose nothing. She said herself she did not wish to change her position, and with her love I cannot feel envious of Serpukhovskoy." And slowly twirling his moustaches, he got up from the table and walked about the room. His eyes shone particularly brightly, and he felt in that confident, calm and happy frame of mind which always came after he had thoroughly faced his position. Everything was straight and clear, just as after former days of reckoning. He shaved, took a cold bath, dressed, and went out. Chapter 21. "I've come to fetch you. Your lessive lasted a good time today," said Petritsky. "Well, is it over?" "It is over," answered Vronsky, smiling with his eyes only, and twirling the tips of his moustaches as circumspectly as though, after the perfect order into which his affairs had been brought, any over-bold or rapid movement might disturb it. "You're always just as if you'd come out of a bath after it," said Petritsky. "I've come from Gritsky's." That was what they called the colonel. "They're expecting you." Vronsky, without answering, looked at his comrade, thinking of something else. "Yes, is that music at his place?" he said, listening to the familiar sounds of polkas and waltzes floating across to him. "What's the fate?" "Serpukhovskoy's come." "Aha!" said Vronsky. "Why, I didn't know." The smile in his eyes gleamed more brightly than ever. Having once made up his mind that he was happy in his love, that he sacrificed his ambition to it, having anyway taken up this position, Vronsky was incapable of feeling either envious of Serpukhovskoy or hurt with him for not coming first to him when he came to the regiment. Serpukhovskoy was a good friend, and he was delighted he had come. "Ah, I'm very glad." The colonel, Damien, had taken a large country house. The whole party were in the wide lower balcony. In the courtyard, the first objects that met Vronsky's eyes were a band of singers in white linen coats standing near a barrel of vodka, and the robust, good-humoured figure of the colonel surrounded by officers. He had gone out as far as the first step of the balcony and was loudly shouting across the band that played Offenbach's quadrille, waving his arms and giving some orders to a few soldiers standing on one side. A group of soldiers, a quartermaster and several subalterns came up to the balcony with Vronsky. The colonel returned to the table, went out again onto the steps with the tumbler in his hand, and proposed the toast. "To the health of our former comrade, the gallant general, Prince Serpukhovskoy! Hurrah!" The colonel was followed by Serpukhovskoy, who came out onto the steps smiling with a glass in his hand. "You always get younger, Bondarenko," he said to the rosy-cheeked, smart-looking quartermaster standing just before him, still youngish-looking, though doing his second term of service. It was 3 years since Vronsky had seen Serpukhovskoy. He looked more robust, had let his whiskers grow, but was still the same graceful creature, whose face and figure were even more striking from their softness and nobility than their beauty. The only change Vronsky detected in him was that subdued, continual radiance of beaming content which settles on the faces of men who are successful and are sure of recognition of their success by everyone. Vronsky knew that radiant air, and immediately observed it in Serpukhovskoy. As Serpukhovskoy came down the steps, he saw Vronsky. A smile of pleasure lighted up his face. He tossed his head upwards and waved the glass in his hand, greeting Vronsky, and showed him by the gesture that he could not come to him before the quartermaster, who stood craning forward his lips ready to be kissed. "Here he is!" shouted the colonel. "Yashvin told me you were in one of your gloomy tempers." Serpukhovskoy kissed the moist, fresh lips of the gallant-looking quartermaster, and wiping his mouth with his handkerchief, went up to Vronsky. "How glad I am," he said, squeezing his hand and drawing him on one side. "You look after him," the colonel shouted to Yashvin, pointing to Vronsky, and he went down below to the soldiers. "Why weren't you at the races yesterday? I expected to see you there," said Vronsky, scrutinizing Serpuhovskoy. "I did go, but late. I beg your pardon," he added, and he turned to the adjutant. "Please have this divided from me, each man as much as it runs to," and he hurriedly took notes for 300 roubles from his pocket-book, blushing a little. "Vronsky, have anything to eat or drink?" asked Yashvin. "Hi, something for the Count to eat. Ah, here it is. Have a glass." The fete at the colonel's lasted a long while. There was a great deal of drinking. They tossed Serpuhovskoy in the air and caught him again several times. Then they did the same to the colonel. Then, to the accompaniment of the band, the colonel himself danced with Petritsky. Then the colonel, who began to show signs of feebleness, sat down on a bench in the courtyard and began demonstrating to Yashvin the superiority of Russia over Poland, especially in cavalry attack, and there was a lull in the revelry for a moment. Serpuhovskoy went into the house to the bathroom to wash his hands and found Vronsky there. Vronsky was drenching his head with water. He had taken off his coat and put his sunburnt, hairy neck under the tap and was rubbing it and his head with his hands. When he had finished, Vronsky sat down by Serpuhovskoy. They both sat down in the bathroom on a lounge, and a conversation began which was very interesting to both of them. "I've always been hearing about you through my wife," said Serpuhovskoy. "I'm glad you've been seeing her pretty often." "She's friendly with Varya, and they're the only women in Petersburg I care about seeing," answered Vronsky, smiling. He smiled because he foresaw the topic the conversation would turn on, and he was glad of it. "The only ones?" Serpuhovskoy queried, smiling. "Yes. And I heard news of you, but not only through your wife," said Vronsky, checking his hint by a stern expression of face. "I was greatly delighted to hear of your success, but not a bit surprised. I expected even more." Serpuhovskoy smiled. Such an opinion of him was obviously agreeable to him, and he did not think it necessary to conceal it. "Well, I, on the contrary, expected less, I'll own frankly. But I'm glad, very glad. I'm ambitious. That's my weakness, and I confess to it." "Perhaps you wouldn't confess to it if you hadn't been successful," said Vronsky. "I don't suppose so," said Serpuhovskoy, smiling again. "I won't say life wouldn't be worth living without it, but it would be dull. Of course I may be mistaken, but I fancy I have a certain capacity for the line I've chosen, and that power of any sort in my hands, if it is to be, will be better than in the hands of a good many people I know," said Serpuhovskoy, with beaming consciousness of success. "And so the nearer I get to it, the better pleased I am." "Perhaps that is true for you, but not for everyone. I used to think so too, but here I live and think life worth living not only for that." "There, it's out. Here it comes," said Serpuhovskoy, laughing. "Ever since I heard about you, about your refusal, I began... Of course, I approve of what you did, but there are ways of doing everything. And I think your action was good in itself, but you didn't do it quite in the way you ought to have done." "What's done can't be undone, and you know I never go back on what I've done, and besides, I'm very well off." "Very well off, for the time, but you're not satisfied with that. I wouldn't say this to your brother. He's a nice child, like our host here. There he goes," he added, listening to the roar of "Hurrah!" "And he's happy, but that does not satisfy you." "I didn't say it did satisfy me." "Yes, but that's not the only thing. Such men as you are wanted." "By whom?" By whom? By society, by Russia. Russia needs men. She needs a party, or everything goes and will go to the dogs. How do you mean? Bertenyev's party against the Russian communists? No, said Serpukhovskoy, frowning with vexation at being suspected of such an absurdity. Tout ça est une blague. That's always been and always will be. There are no communists, but intriguing people have to invent a noxious, dangerous party. It's an old trick. No, what's wanted is a powerful party of independent men like you and me. But why so? Vronsky mentioned a few men who were in power. Why aren't they independent men? Simply because they have not, or have not had from birth, an independent fortune. They've not had a name. They've not been close to the sun and center as we have. They can be bought either by money or by favor, and they have to find a support for themselves in inventing a policy. And they bring forward some notion, some policy that they don't believe in, that does harm, and the whole policy is really only a means to a government house and so much income. S'il n'est pas plus fin que ça when you get a peep at their cards. I may be inferior to them, stupider perhaps, though I don't see why I should be inferior to them. But you and I have one important advantage over them for certain, in being more difficult to buy, and such men are more needed than ever. Vronsky listened attentively, but he was not so much interested by the meaning of the words as by the attitude of Serpukhovskoy, who was already contemplating a struggle with the existing powers, and already had his likes and dislikes in that higher world, while his own interest in the government world did not go beyond the interests of his regiment. Vronsky felt, too, how powerful Serpukhovskoy might become through his unmistakable faculty for thinking things out and for taking things in, through his intelligence and gift of words, so rarely met with in the world in which he moved. And, ashamed as he was of the feeling, he felt envious. Still, I haven't the one thing of most importance for that, he answered. I haven't the desire for power. I had it once, but it's gone. Excuse me, that's not true, said Serpukhovskoy, smiling. Yes, it is true. It is true. Now, Vronsky added, to be truthful. Yes, it is true now. That's another thing. But that now won't last forever. Perhaps, answered Vronsky. You say perhaps, Serpukhovskoy went on, as though guessing his thoughts. But I say for certain. And that's what I wanted to see you for. Your action was just what it should have been. I see that, but you ought not to keep it up. I only ask you to give me carte blanche. I'm not going to offer you my protection, though indeed why shouldn't I protect you? You've protected me often enough. I should hope our friendship rises above all that sort of thing. Yes, he said, smiling to him as tenderly as a woman. Give me carte blanche. Retire from the regiment, and I'll draw you upwards imperceptibly. But you must understand that I want nothing, said Vronsky, except that all should be as it is. Serpukhovskoy got up and stood facing him. You say that all should be as it is. I understand what that means. But listen, we're the same age. You've known a greater number of women, perhaps, than I have. Serpukhovskoy's smile and gestures told Vronsky that he mustn't be afraid, that he would be tender and careful in touching the sore place. But I'm married, and believe me, in getting to know thoroughly one's wife, if one loves her, as someone has said, one gets to know all women better than if one knew thousands of them. We're coming directly, Vronsky shouted to an officer who looked into the room and called them to the colonel. Vronsky was longing now to hear to the end and know what Serpukhovskoy would say to him. And here's my opinion for you. Women are the chief stumbling block in a man's career. It's hard to love a woman and do anything. There's only one way of having love conveniently without it being a hindrance. That's marriage. How? How am I to tell you what I mean? Said Serpukhovskoy, who liked similes. Wait a minute. Yes. Just as you can only carry a fardeau and do something with your hands when the fardeau is tied on your back. And that's marriage. And that's what I felt when I was married. My hands were suddenly set free. But to drag that fardeau about with you without marriage, your hands will always be so full that you can do nothing. Look at Mazankov, at Krupov. They've ruined their careers for the sake of women. What women? Said Vronsky, recalling the Frenchwoman and the actress with whom the two men he had mentioned were connected. The firmer the woman's footing in society, the worse it is. That's much the same as not merely carrying the fardeau in your arms, but tearing it away from someone else. You have never loved, Vronsky said softly, looking straight before him and thinking of Anna. Perhaps. But you remember what I've said to you. And another thing, women are all more materialistic than men. We make something immense out of love, but they are always terre-à-terre. Directly, he cried to a footman who came in. But the footman had not come to call them again, as he supposed. The footman brought Vronsky a note. A man brought it from Princess Tverskaya. Vronsky opened the letter and flushed crimson. My head's begun to ache. I'm going home, he said to Serpukhovskoy. Oh, goodbye then. You give me carte blanche. We'll talk about it later on. I'll look you up in Petersburg. Chapter 22. It was 6 o'clock already, and so in order to be there quickly and at the same time not to drive with his own horses, known to everyone, Vronsky got into Yashvin's hired fly and told the driver to drive as quickly as possible. It was a roomy, old-fashioned fly with seats for 4. He sat in one corner, stretched his legs out on the front seat and sank into meditation. A vague sense of the order into which his affairs had been brought, a vague recollection of the friendliness and flattery of Serpukhovskoy, who had considered him a man that was needed, and most of all the anticipation of the interview before him, all blended into a general, joyous sense of life. This feeling was so strong that he could not help smiling. He dropped his legs, crossed one leg over the other knee, and taking it in his hand, felt the springy muscles of the calf, where it had been grazed the day before by his fall, and leaning back he drew several deep breaths. I'm happy, very happy, he said to himself. He had often before had this sense of physical joy in his own body, but he had never felt so fond of himself, of his own body, as at that moment. He enjoyed the slight ache in his strong leg. He enjoyed the muscular sensation of movement in his chest as he breathed. The bright, cold August day, which had made Anna feel so hopeless, seemed to him keenly stimulating, and refreshed his face and neck that still tingled from the cold water. The scent of brilliantine on his whiskers struck him as particularly pleasant in the fresh air. Everything he saw from the carriage window, everything in that cold, pure air, in the pale light of the sunset, was fresh and gay and as strong as he was himself. The roofs of the houses shining in the rays of the setting sun, the sharp outlines of fences and angles of buildings, the figures of passers-by, the carriages that met him now and then, the motionless green of the trees and grass, the fields with evenly drawn furrows of potatoes, and the slanting shadows that fell from the houses, and trees and bushes, and even from the rows of potatoes. Everything was bright, like a pretty landscape just finished and freshly varnished. Get on, he said to the driver, putting his head out of the window, and pulling a 3-ruble note out of his pocket he handed it to the man as he looked round. The driver's hand fumbled with something at the lamp, the whip cracked, and the carriage rolled rapidly along the smooth high road. "I want nothing, nothing but this happiness," he thought, staring at the bone button of the bell in the space between the windows, and picturing to himself Anna just as he had seen her last time. "And as I go on, I love her more and more. Here's the garden of the Vrede villa. Whereabouts will she be? Where? How? Why did she fix on this place to meet me? And why does she write in Betsy's letter?" he thought, wondering now for the first time at it. But there was now no time for wonder. He called to the driver to stop before reaching the avenue, and opening the door, jumped out of the carriage as it was moving, and went into the avenue that led up to the house. There was no one in the avenue, but looking round to the right, he caught sight of her. Her face was hidden by a veil, but he drank in with glad eyes the special movement in walking, peculiar to her alone, the slope of the shoulders and the setting of the head, and at once a sort of electric shock ran all over him. With fresh force he felt conscious of himself, from the springy motions of his legs to the movements of his lungs as he breathed, and something set his lips twitching. Joining him, she pressed his hand tightly. "You are not angry that I sent for you? I absolutely had to see you," she said, and the serious and set line of her lips, which he saw under the veil, transformed his mood at once. "I angry? But how have you come? Where from?" "Never mind," she said, laying her hand on his. "Come along, I must talk to you." He saw that something had happened, and that the interview would not be a joyous one. In her presence he had no will of his own. Without knowing the grounds of her distress, he already felt the same distress unconsciously passing over him. "What is it? What?" he asked her, squeezing her hand with his elbow, and trying to read her thoughts in her face. She walked on a few steps in silence, gathering up her courage. Then suddenly she stopped. "I did not tell you yesterday," she began, breathing quickly and painfully, "that coming home with Alexey Alexandrovitch, I told him everything, told him I could not be his wife, and told him everything." He heard her, unconsciously bending his whole figure down to her, as though hoping in this way to soften the hardness of her position for her. But directly she had said this, he suddenly drew himself up, and a proud and hard expression came over his face. Yes, that's better, 1,000 times better. I know how painful it was," he said. But she was not listening to his words. She was reading his thoughts from the expression of his face. She could not guess that that expression arose from the first idea that presented itself to Vronsky, that a duel was now inevitable. The idea of a duel had never crossed her mind, and so she put a different interpretation on this passing expression of hardness. When she got her husband's letter, she knew then at the bottom of her heart that everything would go on in the old way, and that she would not have the strength of will to forego her position, to abandon her son, and to join her lover. The morning spent at Princess Tverskaya's had confirmed her still more in this, but this interview was still of the utmost gravity for her. She hoped that this interview would transform her position and save her. If, on hearing this news, he were to say to her resolutely, passionately, without an instant's wavering, "Throw up everything and come with me," she would give up her son and go away with him. But this news had not produced what she had expected in him. He simply seemed as though he were resenting some affront. "It was not in the least painful to me. It happened of itself," she said irritably. "And see!" She pulled her husband's letter out of her glove. I understand," he interrupted her, taking the letter but not reading it, and trying to soothe her. "The one thing I longed for, the one thing I prayed for, was to cut short this position, so as to devote my life to your happiness." "Why do you tell me that?" she said. "Do you suppose I can doubt it? If I doubted—" "Who's that coming?" said Vronsky suddenly, pointing to two ladies walking towards them. Perhaps they know us," and he hurriedly turned off, drawing her after him into a side path. "Oh, I don't care," she said. Her lips were quivering, and he fancied that her eyes looked with strange fury at him from under the veil. "I tell you that's not the point. I can't doubt that. But see what he writes to me. Read it." She stood still again. Again, just as at the first moment of hearing of her rupture with her husband, Vronsky, on reading the letter, was unconsciously carried away by the natural sensation aroused in him by his own relation to the betrayed husband. Now, while he held his letter in his hands, he could not help picturing the challenge, which he would most likely find at home today or tomorrow, and the duel itself, in which, with the same cold and haughty expression that his face was assuming at this moment, he would await the injured husband's shot, after having himself fired into the air. And at that instant there flashed across his mind the thought of what Serpukhowsky had just said to him, and what he had himself been thinking in the morning, that it was better not to bind himself, and he knew that this thought he could not tell her. Having read the letter, he raised his eyes to her, and there was no determination in them. She saw at once that he had been thinking about it before by himself. She knew that whatever he might say to her, he would not say all he thought. And she knew that her last hope had failed her. This was not what she had been reckoning on. "You see the sort of man he is," she said, with a shaking voice. "He—" "Forgive me, but I rejoice at it," Vronsky interrupted. "For God's sake, let me finish," he added, his eyes imploring her to give him time to explain his words. "I rejoice because things cannot possibly remain as he supposes." "Why can't they?" Anna said, restraining her tears, and obviously attaching no sort of consequence to what he said. She felt that her fate was sealed. Vronsky meant that after the duel, inevitable, he thought, things could not go on as before, but he said something different. "It can't go on. I hope that now you will leave him. I hope," he was confused and reddened, "that you will let me arrange and plan our life. Tomorrow," he was beginning. She did not let him go on. "But my child," she shrieked, "you see what he writes? I should have to leave him, and I can't and won't do that. But for God's sake, which is better? Leave your child or keep up this degrading position? To whom is it degrading? To all, and most of all to you." "You say degrading. Don't say that. Those words have no meaning for me," she said in a shaking voice. She did not want him now to say what was untrue. She had nothing left her but his love, and she wanted to love him. "Don't you understand that from the day I loved you everything has changed for me? For me there is one thing, and one thing only, your love. If that's mine, I feel so exalted, so strong, that nothing can be humiliating to me. I am proud of my position, because proud of being proud—" She could not say what she was proud of. Tears of shame and despair choked her utterance. She stood still and sobbed. She could not say what she was proud of. Tears of shame and despair choked her utterance. She stood still and sobbed. He felt, too, something swelling in his throat and twitching in his nose, and for the first time in his life he felt on the point of weeping. He could not have said exactly what it was touched him so. He felt sorry for her, and he felt he could not help her, and with that he knew that he was to blame for her wretchedness, and that he had done something wrong. "Is not a divorce possible?" he said feebly. She shook her head, not answering. "Couldn't you take your son and still leave him?" "Yes, but it all depends on him. Now I must go to him," she said shortly. Her presentiment that all would again go on in the old way had not deceived her. "On Tuesday I shall be in Petersburg, and everything can be settled." "Yes," she said, "but don't let us talk any more of it." Anna's carriage, which she had sent away and ordered to come back to the little gate of the Vrede garden, drove up. Anna said good-bye to Vronsky and drove home. Chapter 23. On Monday there was the usual sitting of the Commission of the 2nd of June. Alexey Alexandrovitch walked into the hall where the sitting was held, greeted the members and the president as usual, and sat down in his place, putting his hand on the papers laid ready for him. Among these papers lay the necessary evidence and a rough outline of the speech he intended to make. But he did not really need these documents. He remembered every point, and did not think it necessary to go over in his memory what he would say. He knew that when the time came, and when he saw his enemy facing him, and studiously endeavouring to assume an expression of indifference, his speech would flow of itself better than he could prepare it now. He felt that the import of his speech was of such magnitude that every word of it would have weight. Meantime, as he listened to the usual report, he had the most innocent and inoffensive air. No one, looking at his white hands, with their swollen veins and long fingers, so softly stroking the edges of the white paper that lay before him, and at the air of weariness with which his head drooped on one side, would have suspected that in a few minutes a torrent of words would flow from his lips that would arouse a fearful storm, set the members shouting and attacking one another, and force the president to call for order. When the report was over, Alexey Alexandrovitch announced in his subdued, delicate voice that he had several points to bring before the meeting in regard to the Commission for the Reorganization of the Native Tribes. All attention was turned upon him. Alexey Alexandrovitch cleared his throat, and not looking at his opponent, but selecting, as he always did while he was delivering his speeches, the first person sitting opposite him, an inoffensive little old man who never had an opinion of any sort in the commission, began to expound his views. When he reached the point about the fundamental and radical law, his opponent jumped up and began to protest. Stremov, who was also a member of the commission, and also stung to the quick, began defending himself, and altogether a stormy sitting followed. But Alexey Alexandrovitch triumphed, and his motion was carried, 3 new commissions were appointed, and the next day, in a certain Petersburg circle, nothing else was talked of but this sitting. Alexey Alexandrovitch's success had been even greater than he had anticipated. Next morning, Tuesday, Alexey Alexandrovitch, on waking up, recollected with pleasure his triumph of the previous day, and he could not help smiling, though he tried to appear indifferent, when the chief secretary of his department, anxious to flatter him, informed him of the rumours that had reached him concerning what had happened in the commission. Absorbed in business with the chief secretary, Alexey Alexandrovitch had completely forgotten that it was Tuesday, the day fixed by him for the return of Anna Arkadyevna, and he was surprised and received a shock of annoyance when a servant came in to inform him of her arrival. Anna had arrived in Petersburg early in the morning. The carriage had been sent to meet her in accordance with her telegram, and so Alexey Alexandrovitch might have known of her arrival. But when she arrived, he did not meet her. She was told that he had not yet gone out, but was busy with his secretary. She sent word to her husband that she had come, went to her own room, and occupied herself in sorting out her things, expecting he would come to her. But an hour passed. He did not come. She went into the dining-room on the pretext of giving some directions, and spoke loudly on purpose, expecting him to come out there, but he did not come, though she heard him go to the door of his study as he parted from the chief secretary. She knew that he usually went out quickly to his office, and she wanted to see him before that, so that their attitude to one another might be defined. She walked across the drawing-room and went resolutely to him. When she went into his study, he was in official uniform, obviously ready to go out, sitting at a little table on which he rested his elbows, looking dejectedly before him. She saw him before he saw her, and she saw that he was thinking of her. On seeing her, he would have risen, but changed his mind. Then his face flushed hotly, a thing Anna had never seen before, and he got up quickly and went to meet her, looking not at her eyes, but above them, at her forehead and hair. He went up to her, took her by the hand, and asked her to sit down. "I am very glad you have come," he said, sitting down beside her, and obviously wishing to say something, he stuttered. Several times he tried to begin to speak, but stopped. In spite of the fact that, preparing herself for meeting him, she had schooled herself to despise and reproach him, she did not know what to say to him, and she felt sorry for him. And so the silence lasted for some time. "Is Seryozha quite well?" he said, and not waiting for an answer, he added, "I shan't be dining at home today, and I have got to go out directly." "I had thought of going to Moscow," she said. "No, you did quite right to come," he said, and was silent again. Seeing that he was powerless to begin the conversation, she began herself. "Alexey Alexandrovitch," she said, looking at him and not dropping her eyes under his persistent gaze at her hair, "I am a guilty woman. I am a bad woman, but I am the same as I was, as I told you then, and I have come to tell you that I can change nothing." "I have asked you no question about that," he said all at once, resolutely and with hatred, looking her straight in the face. "That was as I had supposed." Under the influence of anger, he apparently regained complete possession of all his faculties. "But as I told you then, and have written to you," he said in a thin, shrill voice, "I repeat now that I am not bound to know this. I ignore it. Not all wives are so kind as you, to be in such a hurry to communicate such agreeable news to their husbands." He laid special emphasis on the word agreeable. "I shall ignore it so long as the world knows nothing of it, so long as my name is not disgraced. And so I simply inform you that our relations must be just as they have always been, and that only in the event of your compromising me shall I be obliged to take steps to secure my honor." "But our relations cannot be the same as always," Anna began in a timid voice, looking at him with dismay. When she saw once more those composed gestures, heard that shrill, childish, and sarcastic voice, her aversion for him extinguished her pity for him, and she felt only afraid, but at all costs she wanted to make clear her position. "I cannot be your wife while she began. He laughed a cold and malignant laugh. "The manner of life you have chosen is reflected, I suppose, in your ideas. I have too much respect or contempt, or both. I respect your past and despise your present, but I was far from the interpretation you put on my words." Anna sighed and bowed her head. "Though indeed I fail to comprehend how, with the independence you show," he went on, getting hot, "announcing your infidelity to your husband and seeing nothing reprehensible in it, apparently, you can see anything reprehensible in performing a wife's duties in relation to your husband." "Alexey Alexandrovitch, what is it you want of me?" "I want you not to meet that man here, and to conduct yourself so that neither the world nor the servants can reproach you. Not to see him. That's not much, I think. And in return, you will enjoy all the privileges of a faithful wife without fulfilling her duties. That's all I have got to say to you. Now it's time for me to go. I'm not dining at home." He got up and moved towards the door. Anna got up too. Bowing in silence, he let her pass before him. Chapter 24. The night spent by Levin on the haycock did not pass without result for him. The way in which he had been managing his land revolted him and had lost all attraction for him. In spite of the magnificent harvest, never had there been, or at least never it seemed to him, had there been so many hindrances and so many quarrels between him and the peasants as that year, and the origin of these failures and this hostility was now perfectly comprehensible to him. The delight he had experienced in the work itself, and the consequent greater intimacy with the peasants, the envy he felt of them, of their life, the desire to adopt that life, which had been to him that night not a dream but an intention, the execution of which he had thought out in detail, all this had so transformed his view of the farming of the land as he had managed it, that he could not take his former interest in it, and could not help seeing that unpleasant relation between him and the works-people which was the foundation of it all. The herd of improved cows, such as Parva, the whole land ploughed over and enriched, the 9 level fields surrounded with hedges, the 240 acres heavily manured, the seed sown in drills, and all the rest of it. It was all splendid if only the work had been done for themselves, or for themselves and comrades, people in sympathy with them. But he saw clearly now. His work on a book of agriculture, in which the chief element in husbandry was to have been the labourer, greatly assisted him in this, that the sort of farming he was carrying on was nothing but a cruel and stubborn struggle between him and the labourers, in which there was on one side, his side, a continual intense effort to change everything to a pattern he considered better, on the other side the natural order of things. And in the struggle he saw that with immense expenditure of force on his side, and with no effort or even intention on the other side, all that was attained was that the work did not go to the liking of either side, and that splendid tools, splendid cattle and land were spoiled with no good to anyone. Worst of all, the energy expended on this work was not simply wasted. He could not help feeling now, since the meaning of this system had become clear to him, that the aim of his energy was a most unworthy one. In reality, what was the struggle about? He was struggling for every farthing of his share, and he could not help it, for he had only to relax his efforts and he would not have had the money to pay his labourers' wages, while they were only struggling to be able to do their work easily and agreeably, that is to say, as they were used to doing it. It was for his interests that every labourer should work as hard as possible, and that while doing so he should keep his wits about him, so as to try not to break the winnowing machines, the horse rakes, the thrashing machines, that he should attend to what he was doing. What the labourer wanted was to work as pleasantly as possible, with rests, and above all, carelessly and heedlessly, without thinking. That summer, Levin saw this at every step. He sent the men to mow some clover for hay, picking out the worst patches where the clover was overgrown with grass and weeds and of no use for seed. Again and again they mowed the best acres of clover, justifying themselves by the pretence that the bailiff had told them to, and trying to pacify him with the assurance that it would be splendid hay. But he knew that it was owing to those acres being so much easier to mow. He sent out a hay machine for pitching the hay. It was broken at the first row, because it was dull work for a peasant to sit on the seat in front, with the great wings waving above him, and he was told, "Don't trouble, your honour, sure the women folks will pitch it quick enough." The ploughs were practically useless, because it never occurred to the labourer to raise the share when he turned the plough, and forcing it round, he strained the horses and tore up the ground, and Levin was begged not to mind about it. The horses were allowed to stray into the wheat because not a single labourer would consent to be night watchman, and in spite of orders to the contrary, the labourers insisted on taking turns for night duty, and Ivan, after working all day long, fell asleep and was very penitent for his fault, saying, "Do what you will to me, your honour." They killed 3 of the best calves by letting them into the clover aftermath without care as to their drinking, and nothing would make the men believe that they had been blown out by the clover. But they told him, by way of consolation, that one of his neighbours had lost 112 head of cattle in 3 days. All this happened, not because anyone felt ill will to Levin or his farm. On the contrary, he knew that they liked him, thought him a simple gentleman, their highest praise. But it happened simply because all they wanted was to work merrily and carelessly, and his interests were not only remote and incomprehensible to them, but fatally opposed to their most just claims. Long before, Levin had felt dissatisfaction with his own position in regard to the land. He saw where his boat leaked, but he did not look for the leak, perhaps purposely deceiving himself. Nothing would be left him if he lost faith in it. But now he could deceive himself no longer. The farming of the land, as he was managing it, had become not merely unattractive, but revolting to him, and he could take no further interest in it. To this now was joined the presence, only 25 miles off, of Kitty Shtcherbatskaya, whom he longed to see and could not see. Darya Alexandrovna Oblonskaya had invited him, when he was over there, to come with the object of renewing his offer to her sister, who would, she gave him to understand, accept him now. Levin himself had felt on seeing Kitty Shtcherbatskaya that he had never ceased to love her, but he could not go over to the Oblonskys knowing she was there. The fact that he had made her an offer and she had refused him had placed an insuperable barrier between her and him. "I can't ask her to be my wife merely because she can't be the wife of the man she wanted to marry," he said to himself. The thought of this made him cold and hostile to her. "I should not be able to speak to her without a feeling of reproach. I could not look at her without resentment, and she will only hate me all the more, as she's bound to. And besides, how can I now, after what Darya Alexandrovna told me, go to see them? Can I help showing that I know what she told me? And me, to go magnanimously to forgive her and have pity on her? Me, go through a performance before her of forgiving, and deigning to bestow my love on her? What induced Darya Alexandrovna to tell me that? By chance I might have seen her, then everything could have happened of itself. But as it is out of the question, out of the question." Darya Alexandrovna sent him a letter, asking him for a side-saddle for Kitty's use. "I am told you have a side-saddle," she wrote to him. "I hope you will bring it over yourself." This was more than he could stand. How could a woman of any intelligence, of any delicacy, put her sister in such a humiliating position? He wrote 10 notes and tore them all up, and sent the saddle without any reply. To write that he would go was impossible, because he could not go. To write that he could not come because something prevented him, or that he would be away, that was still worse. He sent the saddle without an answer, and with a sense of having done something shameful. He handed over all the now revolting business of the estate to the bailiff, and set off next day to a remote district to see his friend, Sviazhsky, who had splendid marshes for grouse in his neighbourhood, and had lately written to ask him to keep a long-standing promise to stay with him. The grouse marsh in the Surovsky district had long tempted Levin, but he had continually put off this visit on account of his work on the estate. Now he was glad to get away from the neighbourhood of the Shtcherbatskys, and still more from his farm work, especially on a shooting expedition, which always in trouble served as the best consolation. Chapter 25. In the Surovsky district there was no railway nor service of post-horses, and Levin drove there with his own horses in his big, old-fashioned carriage. He stopped halfway at a well-to-do peasant's to feed his horses. A bald, well-preserved old man, with a broad, red beard, grey on his cheeks, opened the gate, squeezing against the gate-post to let the 3 horses pass. Directing the coachman to a place under the shed in the big, clean, tidy yard, with charred old-fashioned ploughs in it, the old man asked Levin to come into the parlour. A cleanly dressed young woman with clogs on her bare feet was scrubbing the floor in the new outer room. She was frightened of the dog that ran in after Levin, and uttered a shriek, but began laughing at her own fright at once when she was told the dog would not hurt her. Pointing Levin with her bare arm to the door into the parlour, she bent down again, hiding her handsome face, and went on scrubbing. "Would you like the samovar?" she asked. "Yes, please." The parlour was a big room, with a Dutch stove and a screen dividing it into 2. Under the holy pictures stood a table painted in patterns, a bench, and 2 chairs. Near the entrance was a dresser full of crockery. The shutters were closed, there were few flies, and it was so clean that Levin was anxious that Laska, who had been running along the road and bathing in puddles, should not muddy the floor, and ordered her to a place in the corner by the door. After looking round the parlour, Levin went out into the back yard. The good-looking young woman in clogs, swinging the empty pails on the yoke, ran on before him to the well for water. "Look sharp, my girl," the old man shouted after her good-humouredly, and he went up to Levin. "Well, sir, are you going to Nikolay Ivanovitch Sviazhsky? His honour comes to us too." He began chatting, leaning his elbows on the railing of the steps. In the middle of the old man's account of his acquaintance with Sviazhsky, the gates creaked again, and labourers came into the yard from the fields, with wooden ploughs and harrows. The horses harnessed to the ploughs and harrows were sleek and fat. The labourers were obviously of the household. 2 were young men in cotton shirts and caps. The 2 others were hired labourers in homespun shirts, one an old man, the other a young fellow. Moving off from the steps, the old man went up to the horses and began unharnessing them. "What have they been ploughing?" asked Levin. "Ploughing up the potatoes. We rent a bit of land too. Fedot, don't let out the gelding, but take it to the trough, and we'll put the other in harness." "Oh, father, the ploughshares I ordered, has he brought them along?" asked the big, healthy-looking fellow, obviously the old man's son. "There, in the outer room," answered the old man, bundling together the harness he had taken off and flinging it onto the ground. "You can put them on while they have dinner." The good-looking young woman came into the outer room with the full pails dragging at her shoulders. More women came on the scene from somewhere, young and handsome, middle-aged, old and ugly, with children and without children. The samovar was beginning to sing. The labourers and the family, having disposed of the horses, came in to dinner. Levin, getting his provisions out of his carriage, invited the old man to take tea with him. "Well, I have had some today already," said the old man, obviously accepting the invitation with pleasure. "But just a glass for company." Over their tea, Levin heard all about the old man's farming. 10 years before, the old man had rented 300 acres from the lady who owned them, and a year ago he had bought them and rented another 300 from a neighbouring landowner. A small part of the land, the worst part, he let out for rent, while 100 acres of arable land he cultivated himself with his family and 2 hired laborers. The old man complained that things were doing badly, but Levin saw that he simply did so from a feeling of propriety, and that his farm was in a flourishing condition. If it had been unsuccessful, he would not have bought land at 35 rubles the acre, he would not have married his 3 sons and a nephew, he would not have rebuilt twice after fires, and each time on a larger scale. In spite of the old man's complaints, it was evident that he was proud, and justly proud, of his prosperity, proud of his sons, his nephew, his sons' wives, his horses and his cows, and especially of the fact that he was keeping all this farming going. From his conversation with the old man, Levin thought he was not averse to new methods either. He had planted a great many potatoes, and his potatoes, as Levin had seen driving past, were already past flowering and beginning to die down, while Levin's were only just coming into flower. He earthed up his potatoes with a modern plough borrowed from a neighbouring landowner. He sowed wheat. The trifling fact that, thinning out his rye, the old man used the rye he thinned out for his horses, specially struck Levin. How many times had Levin seen this splendid fodder wasted, and tried to get it saved, but always it had turned out to be impossible. The peasant got this done, and he could not say enough in praise of it as food for the beasts. "What have the wenches to do? They carry it out in bundles to the roadside, and the cart brings it away." "Well, we landowners can't manage well with our labourers," said Levin, handing him a glass of tea. "Thank you," said the old man, and he took the glass, but refused sugar, pointing to a lump he had left. "They're simple destruction," said he. "Look at Sviazhsky's, for instance. We know what the land's like. First rate, yet there's not much of a crop to boast of. It's not looked after enough, that's all it is." "But you work your land with hired labourers." "We're all peasants together. We go into everything ourselves. If a man's no use, he can go, and we can manage by ourselves." "Father, Finoghan wants some tar," said the young woman in the clogs, coming in. Yes, that's how it is, sir," said the old man, getting up, and crossing himself deliberately, he thanked Levin and went out. When Levin went into the kitchen to call his coachman, he saw the whole family at dinner. The women were standing up waiting on them. The young, sturdy-looking son was telling something funny with his mouth full of pudding, and they were all laughing, the woman in the clogs, who was pouring cabbage soup into a bowl, laughing most merrily of all. Very probably the good-looking face of the young woman in the clogs had a good deal to do with the impression of well-being this peasant household made upon Levin, but the impression was so strong that Levin could never get rid of it. And all the way from the old peasants to Sviazhsky's, he kept recalling this peasant farm as though there was something in this impression that demanded his special attention. Chapter 26. Sviazhsky was the marshal of his district. He was 5 years older than Levin and had long been married. His sister-in-law, a young girl Levin liked very much, lived in his house, and Levin knew that Sviazhsky and his wife would have greatly liked to marry the girl to him. He knew this with certainty, as so-called eligible young men always know it, though he could never have brought himself to speak of it to anyone. And he knew, too, that although he wanted to get married, and although by every token this very attractive girl would make an excellent wife, he could no more have married her, even if he had not been in love with Kitty Shchebatskaya, than he could have flown up to the sky. And this knowledge poisoned the pleasure he had hoped to find in the visit to Sviazhsky. On getting Sviazhsky's letter with the invitation for shooting, Levin had immediately thought of this, but in spite of it he had made up his mind that Sviazhsky's having such views for him was simply his own groundless supposition, and so he would go all the same. Besides, at the bottom of his heart, he had the desire to try himself, put himself to the test in regard to this girl. The Sviazhsky's home life was exceedingly pleasant, and Sviazhsky himself, the best type of man taking part in local affairs that Levin knew, was very interesting to him. Sviazhsky was one of those people, always a source of wonder to Levin, whose convictions, very logical, though never original, go one way by themselves, while their life, exceedingly definite and firm in its direction, goes its way quite apart and almost always in direct contradiction to their convictions. Sviazhsky was an extremely advanced man. He despised the nobility and believed the mass of the nobility to be secretly in favor of serfdom and only concealing their views from cowardice. He regarded Russia as a ruined country, rather after the style of Turkey, and the government of Russia as so bad that he never permitted himself to criticize its doings seriously, and yet he was a functionary of that government and a model marshal of nobility, and when he drove about he always wore the cockade of office and the cap with the red band. He considered human life tolerable only abroad, and went abroad to stay at every opportunity, and at the same time he carried on a complex and improved system of agriculture in Russia, and with extreme interest followed everything and knew everything that was being done in Russia. He considered the Russian peasant as occupying a stage of development intermediate between the ape and the man, and at the same time, in the local assemblies, no one was readier to shake hands with the peasants and listen to their opinion. He believed neither in God nor the devil, but was much concerned about the question of the improvement of the clergy and the maintenance of their revenues, and took special trouble to keep up the church in his village. On the woman question, he was on the side of extreme advocates of complete liberty for women, and especially their right to labor. But he lived with his wife on such terms that their affectionate, childless home life was the admiration of everyone, and arranged his wife's life so that she did nothing and could do nothing but share her husband's efforts that her time should pass as happily and as agreeably as possible. If it had not been a characteristic of Levin's to put the most favorable interpretation on people, Sviazhsky's character would have presented no doubt or difficulty to him. He would have said to himself, a fool or a knave, and everything would have seemed clear. But he could not say a fool, because Sviazhsky was unmistakably clever, and moreover a highly cultivated man who was exceptionally modest over his culture. There was not a subject he knew nothing of, but he did not display his knowledge except when he was compelled to do so. Still less could Levin say that he was a knave, as Sviazhsky was unmistakably an honest, good-hearted, sensible man who worked good-humouredly, keenly, and perseveringly at his work. He was held in high honour by everyone about him, and certainly he had never consciously done, and was indeed incapable of doing anything base. Levin tried to understand him, and could not understand him, and looked at him and his life as at a living enigma. Levin and he were very friendly, and so Levin used to venture to sound Sviazhsky, to try and get at the very foundation of his view of life, but it was always in vain. Every time Levin tried to penetrate beyond the outer chambers of Sviazhsky's mind, which were hospitably open to all, he noticed that Sviazhsky was slightly disconcerted. Faint signs of alarm were visible in his eyes, as though he were afraid Levin would understand him, and he would give him a kindly, good-humoured repulse. Just now, since his disenchantment with farming, Levin was particularly glad to stay with Sviazhsky. Apart from the fact that the sight of this happy and affectionate couple, so pleased with themselves and everyone else, and their well-ordered home had always a cheering effect on Levin, he felt a longing, now that he was so dissatisfied with his own life, to get at that secret in Sviazhsky that gave him such clearness, definiteness, and good courage in life. Moreover, Levin knew that at Sviazhsky's he should meet the landowners of the neighborhood, and it was particularly interesting for him just now to hear and take part in those rural conversations concerning crops, laborers' wages, and so on, which, he was aware, are conventionally regarded as something very low, but which seemed to him just now to constitute the one subject of importance. It was not, perhaps, of importance in the days of serfdom, and it may not be of importance in England. In both cases the conditions of agriculture are firmly established. But among us, now, when everything has been turned upside down and is only just taking shape, the question what form these conditions will take is the one question of importance in Russia, thought Levin. The shooting turned out to be worse than Levin had expected. The marsh was dry, and there were no grouse at all. He walked about the whole day and only brought back 3 birds, but to make up for that, he brought back, as he always did from shooting, an excellent appetite, excellent spirits, and that keen, intellectual mood which with him always accompanied violent physical exertion. And while out shooting, when he seemed to be thinking of nothing at all, suddenly the old man and his family kept coming back to his mind, and the impression of them seemed to claim not merely his attention, but the solution of some question connected with them. In the evening, at tea, 2 landowners who had come about some business connected with a wardship were of the party, and the interesting conversation Levin had been looking forward to sprang up. Levin was sitting beside his hostess at the tea-table, and was obliged to keep up a conversation with her and her sister, who was sitting opposite him. Madame Sviazhska was a round-faced, fair-haired, rather short woman, all smiles and dimples. Levin tried through her to get a solution of the weighty enigma her husband presented to his mind, but he had not complete freedom of ideas, because he was in an agony of embarrassment. This agony of embarrassment was due to the fact that the sister-in-law was sitting opposite to him in a dress, specially put on, as he fancied, for his benefit, cut particularly open in the shape of a trapeze on her white bosom. This quadrangular opening, in spite of the bosom's being very white, or just because it was very white, deprived Levin of the full use of his faculties. He imagined, probably mistakenly, that this low-necked bodice had been made on his account, and felt that he had no right to look at it, and tried not to look at it. But he felt that he was to blame for the very fact of the low-necked bodice having been made. It seemed to Levin that he had deceived someone, that he ought to explain something, but that to explain it was impossible, and for that reason he was continually blushing, was ill at ease, and awkward. His awkwardness infected the pretty sister-in-law too, but their hostess appeared not to observe this, and kept purposely drawing her into the conversation. "You say," she said, pursuing the subject that had been started, "that my husband cannot be interested in what's Russian. It's quite the contrary. He is always in cheerful spirits abroad, but not as he is here. Here he feels in his proper place. He has so much to do, and he has the faculty of interesting himself in everything. Oh, you've not been to see our school, have you?" "I've seen it. The little house covered with ivy, isn't it?" "Yes. That's Nastia's work," she said, indicating her sister. "You teach in it yourself?" asked Levin, trying to look above the open neck, but feeling that wherever he looked in that direction he should see it. "Yes, I used to teach in it myself, and do teach still, but we have a first-rate schoolmistress now." and we've started gymnastic exercises." "No, thank you, I won't have any more tea," said Levin, and conscious of doing a rude thing, but incapable of continuing the conversation, he got up, blushing. "I hear a very interesting conversation," he added, and walked to the other end of the table, where Sviazhsky was sitting with the two gentlemen of the neighborhood. Sviazhsky was sitting sideways, with one elbow on the table and a cup in one hand, while with the other hand he gathered up his beard, held it to his nose and let it drop again as though he was smelling it. His brilliant black eyes were looking straight at the excited country gentleman with grey whiskers, and apparently he derived amusement from his remarks. The gentleman was complaining of the peasants. It was evident to Levin that Sviazhsky knew an answer to this gentleman's complaints, which would at once demolish his whole contention, but that in his position he could not give utterance to this answer, and listened, not without pleasure, to the landowner's comic speeches. The gentleman with the grey whiskers was obviously an inveterate adherent of serfdom and a devoted agriculturalist who had lived all his life in the country. Levin saw proofs of this in his dress, in the old-fashioned threadbare coat, obviously not his everyday attire, in his shrewd, deep-set eyes, in his idiomatic, fluent Russian, in the imperious tone that had become habitual from long use, and in the resolute gestures of his large, red, sunburnt hands with an old betrothal ring on the little finger. Chapter 27. "If I'd only the heart to throw up what's been set going, such a lot of trouble wasted, I'd turn my back on the whole business, sell up, go off like Nikolai Ivanovitch, to hear La Belle Hélène," said the landowner, a pleasant smile lighting up his shrewd old face. "But you see, you don't throw it up," said Nikolai Ivanovitch Sviazhsky, "so there must be something gained." "The only gain is that I live in my own house, neither bought nor hired. Besides, one keeps hoping the people will learn sense. Though, instead of that, you'd never believe it. The drunkenness, the immorality. They keep chopping and changing their bits of land. Not a sight of a horse or a cow. The peasant's dying of hunger, but just go and take him on as a labourer. He'll do his best to do you a mischief, then bring you up before the justice of the peace." "But then you make complaints to the justice too," said Sviazhsky. "Aye, lodge complaints? Not for anything in the world. Such a talking, such a to-do that one would have cause to regret it. At the works, for instance, they pocketed the advanced money and made off. What did the justice do? Why, acquitted them. Nothing keeps them in order but their own communal court and their village elder. He'll flog them in the good old style. But for that there'd be nothing for it but to give it all up and run away.